Step into a modern store in March and Easter looks effortless. Plastic grass, chocolate eggs, and pre-cooked ham stacked in bright aisles. But rewind 150 years, and Easter wasn't something you bought, it was something you survived preparing. Today we're uncovering the forgotten dishes and survival logic behind the Easter table of the 1800s. The 40-day fast, why Easter feasts were a shock to the body. For much of the 1800s, Lent wasn't symbolic dieting. It was strict abstinence. For 40 days, many Christian households eliminated meat, dairy, and eggs. Butter disappeared from the table. Milk vanished from bread dough. Even simple dishes were stripped down to grains, vegetables, and preserved foods. Imagine weeks of eating little more than bread, root vegetables, and pickled foods. The body adjusted to simplicity, to smaller portions of fat and protein. Then Easter morning arrived. Suddenly the table overflowed with rich food, ham glistening with fat, buttered breads, egg-heavy cakes, and sweet pastries. The contrast could be overwhelming. Accounts from the period describe people eating carefully after Lent because the shock of heavy food could upset the stomach. But psychologically, the feast mattered. Easter represented abundance after restraint, warmth after winter, celebration after discipline. Foods that had been forbidden, eggs, milk, butter, returned all at once. The kitchen filled with aromas absent for weeks. Melted butter, caramelizing sugar, roasting meat. That explosive return of flavor was intentional. The Easter meal was meant to feel dramatic. It was the culinary version of spring arriving. The secret history of the bun when bread became illegal. Among the most iconic Easter foods is the humble hot cross bun, soft bread dotted with raisins and marked by a cross. But few people realize this small loaf once carried a strange history of prohibition. In 1592, during the reign of Elizabeth I, authorities attempted to control the sale of spiced buns. These breads had strong associations with religious observances, and officials feared they were being sold too freely. A law restricted their sale to specific occasions: funerals, Christmas, and Good Friday. The ban didn't eliminate them. It pushed them underground. Families began baking the buns themselves, passing recipes quietly through generations. In time, the tradition became inseparable from Good Friday observance. By the 1800s, hot cross buns were sold from street carts, steaming fresh from ovens. Vendors walked crowded roads calling out rhymes to attract customers, which is where the famous nursery rhyme began. But the symbolism ran deeper than simple decoration. The cross on the bun represented the crucifixion. Some traditions claimed the spices symbolized burial spices, while the raisins were said to represent the nails used in the crucifixion story. What began as simple sweet bread became edible theology, a story baked into flour and spice. The ham versus lamb debate, a battle decided by winter. Religiously, lamb holds powerful symbolism in Christian tradition as the Lamb of God. Yet in much of the United States, Easter dinner features ham instead. The reason has little to do with theology and everything to do with agriculture and preservation. In the American South and many rural regions, hogs were easier to raise than sheep or cattle. They required less pasture and could forage freely. That practicality led to the nickname Republic of Porkdom for the United States during parts of the 1800s. But the real key was timing. Pigs were typically slaughtered in the late autumn when cold weather slowed bacterial growth. After butchering, hams were heavily salted and hung in smokehouses to cure for months. By the time early spring arrived, March or April, those cured hams were finally ready to eat, and Easter fell at exactly that moment. So the Easter ham was not originally chosen as a symbolic dish. It was chosen because it was the first preserved meat ready after winter curing. When families gathered around the Easter table, the ham represented the end of scarcity. It meant the smokehouse had done its job. Bread is sacred symbol, the center of the table. In many 19th century households, bread carried the deepest religious symbolism of the Easter meal. Bread represented the body of Christ, making it far more than just another dish. But baking bread in the 1800s demanded patience and physical effort. There were no electric mixers or stand mixers to knead dough. Women mixed heavy dough by hand, sometimes kneading for 20 minutes or more until the texture felt right. Even measuring ingredients was different. Recipes from the time rarely listed precise measurements. A cookbook might say something like, add flour enough to form a dough, or bake until done. Skill came from experience rather than instructions. That meant Easter bread carried risk. If the yeast starter failed, the loaf would not rise. If the oven temperature, judged only by instinct and wood coals, ran too hot, the bread burned. Yet when successful, the result was magnificent. Crusty loaves fragrant with spice, sweet buns studded with fruit, and soft breads meant to be torn apart and shared. Bread was the emotional center of the meal. The 11-ball cake, a dessert with a missing guest. One of the most symbolic Easter desserts of the 19th century was simnel cake. At first glance, it resembles a modest fruit cake, golden, dense, and coated with sweet almond marzipan. But its decoration tells a story. Across the top sit 11 small marzipan balls, not 12. Each ball represents one of the apostles of Jesus Christ. The 12th apostle, Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, is intentionally excluded. In some households, the cake was briefly placed under a hot flame to toast the marzipan balls, giving them a faint golden glow and a sweet roasted almond scent. The symbolism was unmistakable. Every slice reminded the family of the biblical narrative tied to Easter. But again, preparing this cake required intense labor. Almond paste had to be ground by hand with mortar and pestle. Sugar was crushed and mixed carefully until smooth. The result was rich, sweet, and celebratory, exactly the kind of indulgence people craved after weeks of fasting. The Easter of children, eggs before chocolate. Today, Easter for children often means chocolate eggs and candy baskets. But in the 19th century, chocolate eggs were rare luxuries. Companies like Cadbury began producing early chocolate eggs in the 1800s, but they were expensive. Most families could not afford them. Instead, children received simple, hard-boiled eggs. But those eggs were decorated with creativity rather than foil wrappers. Victorian children dyed eggs using natural ingredients found in kitchens. Beets for pink hues, cranberries for soft reds, lemon peels for yellow tones. The process became an activity itself. Pots of simmering dye filled kitchens with earthy smells, sweet fruit, sharp citrus, and vegetable pigments. Children then rolled the eggs across lawns in games that symbolized the rolling away of the stone from Christ's tomb. This tradition eventually became formalized as the White House Easter egg roll, which began in 1876. The eggs were simple, but the symbolism was powerful, life emerging after winter. The labor behind the feast, invisible work. Behind every Easter table stood immense physical labor. Cooking meant hauling water, chopping wood, tending fires, grinding spices, and stirring heavy batters by hand. Dutch ovens, heavy cast iron pots, were placed directly into hot coals, with additional coals piled on top to create even heat. Managing temperature required experience rather than thermometers. Too many coals burned the food, too few left it raw. Preparing a holiday meal could take an entire day of physical effort, And in many households, especially in the American South, this labor was not performed by the household's mistress alone. Enslaved cooks or domestic workers often bore the heaviest burden of preparing elaborate holiday meals. The beauty of the Easter feast existed alongside a reality of exhaustion and inequality. Spring's first greens, the real taste of Easter. After months of surviving on winter storage foods, the first appearance of fresh spring greens was one of the most anticipated moments of the 1800s kitchen. Throughout the long winter, families relied on salted meat, dried grains, root vegetables, and preserved foods stored in cellars and smokehouses. These foods kept people alive, but they lacked the brightness and freshness that only spring could bring. When the ground finally thawed and the fields began to stir with life again, people eagerly searched for the first edible plants pushing through the soil. Dandelion greens, wild herbs, and early vegetables began appearing along fences, fields, and forest edges. These humble plants were gathered by hand and carried back to the kitchen, where they were often sautéed slowly in bacon fat or simmered into simple broths and soups. At first glance, a pot of wild greens didn't look impressive. The leaves were dark, slightly wilted, and sometimes bitter to the taste. But after months of heavy, salty winter foods, that bitterness felt refreshing. It cut through the lingering taste of cured meat and preserved dishes. More importantly, these greens provided nutrients that had been missing from winter diets: iron, fiber, and vitamins that helped restore strength after the cold months. For many families in the 19th century, Easter didn't just represent a religious celebration, it marked something equally meaningful in everyday life: the return of living food. The first greens of spring symbolized renewal, health, and the quiet promise that winter's scarcity was finally ending. The sugar sculptures of the wealthy. While most families colored simple boiled eggs with beet juice and served modest homemade cakes, the wealthiest households celebrated Easter very differently. In elite homes, the table often featured elaborate sugar sculptures and delicate confectionery displays. Long before chocolate became widely affordable, sugar itself was considered a luxury, and skilled confectioners turned it into edible art. These creations could take the shape of birds, lambs, baskets, or ornate eggs, carefully molded and decorated to impress guests. At first glance, these sugar sculptures looked almost too beautiful to eat. They were glossy, fragile, and intricately shaped, often sitting in the center of the table like a decorative centerpiece rather than a dessert. But their beauty came with a cost. Sugar was expensive, and creating these confections required both time and specialized skill, making them a clear symbol of wealth and status. For affluent families, Easter sweets became a way to showcase prosperity and refinement. Guests admired the craftsmanship as much as the taste, and the table itself became a display of luxury. Meanwhile, the working class celebrated Easter in much simpler ways. Their tables held dyed eggs, fresh spring greens, homemade bread, and perhaps a modest cake if ingredients allowed. Instead of sugar sculptures, their celebration focused on the return of seasonal food after the long winter. This sharp contrast between ornate sugar displays and humble seasonal dishes captured a defining truth of the era. Easter was celebrated everywhere, but the way it looked on the table depended greatly on who was sitting around it. The feast after winter. By the time Easter morning arrived in the late 1800s, the feast represented far more than just a holiday meal. It marked the end of a long winter and the beginning of a new season of abundance. For months, families had relied on cold storage foods. Salted meats, root vegetables, dried grains, and preserved supplies kept carefully through the colder months. Easter was often the first true celebration after this long period of restraint and survival. The ham placed at the center of the table had usually been curing since autumn, hanging in a smokehouse through the winter until it was finally ready to eat in early spring. Eggs, which had been avoided during the strict fasting period of Lent, returned to the table in abundance. Fresh greens, newly sprouting from thawing soil, were gathered and cooked as a welcome change from the heavy preserved foods of winter. Every dish carried meaning. The hot cross bun, marked with its signature cross, held centuries of religious symbolism connected to the story of the crucifixion. The ham represented the success of winter preservation and careful planning. Dyed eggs symbolized new life and renewal, reflecting the rebirth of nature after winter's long hold. Even the work that went into preparing the meal, long hours spent beside wood fires, kneading dough and tending ovens, became part of the ritual. The Easter table was never just about eating. It was about endurance, faith, and celebrating the long-awaited return of spring. Next time you unwrap a chocolate bunny or slide a ham into the oven, remember how different Easter once was. Long before supermarkets and candy aisles, the feast took months of curing, days of grinding, kneading, and tending wood fires. Recipes lived in memory, not measuring cups, and every loaf, bun, and cake depended on skill and patience. What feels effortless today was once built from smokehouses, hand-kneaded dough, and relentless labor. And when families finally gathered around those tables, the meaning was simple and powerful. Winter was over, and spring had finally returned.